What is the price of absolute power? It is a price not paid in gold or land, but in flesh and blood. For thousands of years, empire after empire discovered a terrifying truth: that the most formidable obstacle to their rule was not an external enemy, but the very nature of man himself. And so, they set out to systematically destroy it. This is not a story of random cruelty. This is the story of a calculated global solution to a political problem, written in scar tissue and screams. 7 different empires, scattered across time and continent, perfected 7 distinct and horrifying ways to destroy the male body. They engineered a chilling alchemy, transforming living, breathing boys and men into something else entirely, into instruments of state, into trusted servants, into living warnings. And tonight, in this dank Byzantine chamber, a 10-year-old boy was about to experience the first of these dark arts. Oil lamps flickered and spat, their feeble light dancing against damp stone walls, throwing monstrous, wavering shadows of the men who held him down, shadows that loomed like giants, consuming the small room. The metallic, grating scrape of a surgical tool being lifted from a bronze tray sliced through the air, sharper and colder than the boy's own whimpers. These were not enemy soldiers preparing to maim a prisoner of war. These were palace officials, bureaucrats of the flesh. And this trembling, wide-eyed child was the son of a minor Byzantine noble, a man who had sold his own blood to the imperial court for the price of 30 heavy gold coins. The boy's small, desperate fingers clawed at the rough, splintered wood of the table as the court physician approached, the knife in his hand catching a glint of lamplight, a tiny, cruel star in the oppressive gloom. His uncle had promised him glory, a life of immense influence within the emperor's own inner circle, a path to power beyond his station. But no one, not his uncle, not his father, had ever explained what precise price that influence demanded. The blade seemed to drink the light, and somewhere in the deep, echoing darkness beyond the heavy oak chamber door, other boys, just like him, waited their turn in a silent, terrified line. Here is the essential, terrifying thing about castration in the Byzantine Empire. It was not some hidden, shameful secret. It was open, deliberate state policy. The empire needed eunuchs, you see. It needed these altered men to run its vast bureaucracy, to guard its secluded women, to manage its colossal wealth with hands that could never found a rival dynasty. And over centuries, they had perfected the procedure, turning raw butchery into something almost medical. Almost. The physician's steady, practiced hand would remove everything, the entire package of his manhood, in under 60 seconds. If the boy survived the catastrophic blood loss, the relentless infection, the soul-shattering shock, he would wake to a new, alien existence. He would be neither man nor woman, forever trapped between worlds, a walking ghost in the halls of power. But with that profound, irreversible loss came a perverse, intoxicating possibility. This very same screaming child, this victim on the table, might one day lean forward to whisper in the emperor's ear, might command armies with a flick of his wrist, might amass personal fortunes so vast they would make his own father's 30 pieces of gold look like mere pocket change. His future hinged on a single, brutal condition: if he survived the next 10 minutes. How, then, did such a fundamental mutilation become the very foundation of an empire? Why did civilizations across the globe, isolated by oceans and mountains, independently develop the same horrific solution to the same intractable political problem? To understand this profound darkness, we must travel back before this Byzantine midnight, before the knife and the screams, to the very origins, to where systematic castration first emerged from humanity's deepest, most primal fears about power, loyalty, and control. The knife maker in Constantinople, for instance, had only one customer, the imperial palace, and only one product. Each blade he forged was measured to exactly 4 inches, curved with a slight, graceful arc at the tip, honed to a razor's edge, sharp enough to slice through flesh and sinew in one single, fluid motion. He forged them in batches of 12, wrapped each one in pristine, expensive silk, and delivered them to the same, unmarked iron door beneath the great palace complex every 3rd month. The guards who received them never spoke a single word. They didn't need to. Everyone in the city, from the highest minister to the lowest beggar, knew precisely where those perfectly crafted knives were going and what they were destined to do. Down in the cutting rooms, the court physician arranged his tools with the quiet, meticulous precision of a master jeweler. There were bronze forceps, silver clamps, the knife itself, a brazier glowing with hot coals, and clay pots filled with bubbling, sizzling, boiling oil. He had performed this specific procedure over 300 times and had lost only 47 patients. Those were, by the standards of the 9th century, exceptional, almost miraculous numbers. The key, he knew, was relentless, brutal speed. Cut fast, cauterize faster. Get the bleeding, broken boy into the recovery chamber before the shock could fully set in and claim his life. The fundamental difference between Byzantine castration and simple battlefield mutilation came down to one single, chilling word: system. When Bulgar warriors castrated captured Byzantine soldiers, they hacked and sawed with whatever rusty blade was handy, leaving their victims to bleed out, screaming in the mud and the dirt. But here, in the heart of Constantinople, castration had evolved into something almost surgical, almost civilized. The physician knew with anatomical certainty exactly where to cut, how deep to go, what specific angle would minimize arterial blood loss. He knew to pack the seared wound with a pungent mixture of salt and cheap wine. He could almost predict, with a glance, which boys had the inner fortitude to survive, and which ones would simply slip away into death, despite his very best efforts. But the cut itself, as horrifying as it was only the very beginning. The actual physical removal took precisely 57 seconds. The physician's assistant would hold the boy's thin legs apart, while 2 hulking palace guards pinned his arms and shoulders to the table. There was no anesthetic, no mercy of oblivion. They had tried opium once, in an earlier, more experimental time, but the drugged drowsiness dangerously increased bleeding. It was far better, they concluded, to let the pure, unadulterated pain do its own work, to send the body into a natural protective state of shock. The physician would make 2 swift, decisive cuts. First, the testicles, pulled down and severed at their cords. Then, the penis itself, sliced cleanly away at the very base. Both parts would drop with a soft, wet, final sound into a waiting bronze bowl. A sound that would haunt the nightmares of every surviving eunuch for the rest of his long, altered life. Blood would then surge forth in rhythmic, pulsing gouts. This was the single most critical moment. The assistant, moving in a well-rehearsed ballet of horror, already had the iron rod heating in the brazier, its tip glowing a furious orange-white. He would press the searing hot metal directly against the open wound, and the entire chamber would instantly fill with the thick, acrid, unforgettable smell of burning human flesh. The boy's scream would often cut off abruptly as his entire body convulsed, back arching against the restraints. Some vomited. Some lost consciousness immediately. The lucky ones, the physician noted clinically, did both. They would then wrap the charred and weeping wound in silk bandages soaked in honey and wine. Next, they would carefully insert a slender bronze tube into the place where the penis had been. Without this tube, the urethra would seal shut with scar tissue, and the boy would die in agony within days, poisoned by his own retained urine. Then they would carry him, limp and broken, to the recovery chamber, a cold stone room lined with thin straw mattresses, where 20 other boys lay in various, pitiful stages of healing or dying. What they did not tell the hopeful, greedy families was just how many of these children never made it out of that chamber alive. The Byzantine Empire, ever the meticulous record keeper, maintained careful, grim statistics. 1 in every 4 boys died within the first week. Infection claimed most of them. The wound would turn an ominous black. A fever would spike like a fire in their veins, and they would thrash on their straw beds, calling out for the very mothers and fathers who'd sold them for a handful of gold. Another 1 in 10 died in the second week from cascading complications, blocked urine, systemic blood poisoning, or simply from a profound and total despair that extinguished the will to live. The survivors, the ones who clung to life, faced months of unremitting agony as their young bodies struggled to adjust to the fundamental mutilation. They would learn to live with the constant, humiliating presence of the bronze tube, removed only for brief, painful cleanings. They would discover with a creeping dread that their voices were changing, not breaking and deepening like normal boys, but sliding higher, becoming the ethereal, unmistakable soprano that would mark them as different, as other, for the rest of their lives. The Ottomans, learning from their predecessors, later refined the Byzantine method with their own particular brand of ruthless efficiency. They established specialized castration centers in major provincial capitals, Samarkand, Cairo, Basra, places where slavers could easily bring captured boys for systematic processing before shipping the survivors to Constantinople or Baghdad. The key Ottoman innovation was the method of partial castration. Remove only the testicles, but leave the penis physically intact. These altered boys could still urinate normally and faced significantly lower infection rates, yet they remained safely, permanently sterile, perfect for the sensitive duty of guarding the royal harems. The Ottoman surgeons used a different, slower technique. Instead of a swift cut, they would tie a tight silk cord around the scrotum, pulling it tighter and tighter each day, until the blood circulation stopped completely. The testicles, starved of blood, would turn a necrotic black and simply wither away, falling off within a week. Cleaner, the Ottoman surgeons claimed, more humane. The boys writhing in silent agony in the Ottoman castration centers might have passionately disagreed, but their opinions, their pain, did not matter. They were products now, future guards and administrators and trusted servants, walking, talking reminders that in empires built upon absolute power, even the bodies of children could become disposable state property. The screaming they had calculated would last for exactly 7 minutes. They timed it, with sand clocks and steady hearts. 7 minutes from the first, incising cut to the final, sizzling cauterization. 7 minutes that could stretch into subjective hours in those suffocating underground chambers. 7 minutes that irrevocably transformed a whole, complete child into something the empire could safely use, control, and own. The knife method was brutally efficient, chillingly clinical. It turned butchery into a mere branch of bureaucracy. But cold efficiency was not the only goal for every empire. Some civilizations wanted more than just simple castration. They wanted spectacle. They wanted roaring crowds to gasp and point and remember forever. They wanted the kind of visceral, public horror that kept entire populations obedient and terrified. If the knife was a form of precise, private torture, then what happened in Hungary's public squares made the Byzantine surgeons look almost merciful. The crowd in Budapest's main square fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence as the massive iron pincers began to glow a sinister cherry red in the coals of the braziers. Gheorghe, a peasant who had dared to lead 10,000 of his fellow serfs in a bloody revolt against their Hungarian lords, was now trussed and bound, about to learn the ultimate price for men who challenged the established, God-given natural order. The executioners, artists of agony, had built a special, grotesque throne just for him, a chair of iron, heated from below by coal braziers until the metal glowed a dull, hellish red. They would eventually crown him with a circlet of white hot metal, but first they had other, more specific plans for the rebel leader's body. The crowd pressed closer to the high wooden scaffold, a sea of eager, nervous faces. Merchants closed their shops for the day just to watch. Mothers lifted their small children onto their shoulders for a better, clearer view. This was not merely an execution. This was high theatre, a moral lesson written in fire and flesh, and everyone in Budapest, it seemed, had a front row seat. The executioner's assistant pumped the heavy leather bellows, sending a shower of bright sparks dancing up into the afternoon sky. The pincers rested deep within the coals, their tips beginning to shimmer with an intense, white-hot heat. Doja stood naked on the platform, his hands bound tightly behind his back, surrounded by 6 of his captured, starved lieutenants. The authorities had promised these men something very special, a choice that would brand their souls forever. The executioner, with the solemnity of a high priest, lifted the glowing pincers from the fire. The metal had turned from red to orange to a nearly blinding white at the very tips. Waves of heat distorted the air around them, creating a mirage of shimmering agony. Someone in the front of the crowd began to pray in a loud, trembling voice. Others, further back, laughed with a nervous, cruel energy. A few, with weaker stomachs, turned their faces away, but the vast majority leaned forward, craning their necks, eager to see what came next. The pincers closed around Doja's genitals with a sickening, sizzling hiss that carried clearly across the entire square. His scream shattered the afternoon quiet, a raw sound of pure, unadulterated agony that sent pigeons exploding from the high church towers. The smell hit the crowd a second later, a nauseating wave of scorched meat that made hardened soldiers gag and vomit onto the cobblestones. But the executioners were far from done. The assistant already had a second set of pincers heating in the fire, and then a third. The plan was not just to castrate Doja. It was to do it slowly, publicly, piece by agonizing piece, to stretch his ultimate agony across an entire afternoon, all while the city of Budapest watched. Each time the pincers returned to the fire, the crowd's collective anticipation built to a fever pitch. Each time they emerged from the coals, glowing with fresh heat, more of Doja's remaining anatomy was seared away. The psychology of public castration operated on multiple, insidious levels. For the victim, the profound, total humiliation equaled the physical agony. Stripped naked, his genitals systematically destroyed, while hundreds of his fellow citizens watched, and some even jeered. For the crowd, it was both grisly entertainment and a stark, terrifying education. See what happens to rebels. Watch how the mighty are unmade. But something else, something unpredictable, began to happen in that public square. Something the authorities had not fully anticipated. After the third, gruesome application of the white-hot pincers, sections of the massive crowd began to turn. The nervous laughter died away completely. Mothers pulled their children down, pressing small faces into their skirts, covering their eyes. Even hardened mercenaries, hired to keep the peace, looked away, their faces pale, because there was an invisible line between justice and pure sadism, and everyone watching instinctively knew they had collectively crossed that line at least 20 minutes ago. Yet the worst part, the most psychologically devastating act, was not the burning itself. The executioner finally stepped back, examining his handiwork with a critical eye. Doja hung limp in his bonds, his consciousness flickering like a guttering candle. Where his manhood had been, only a ruin of blackened, weeping flesh remained. The assistant threw a bucket of cold, filthy water onto him. This was not an act of mercy. They needed him awake, acutely aware for what was to come next. Remember those 6 starving lieutenants? The ones who had followed Doja into rebellion. The authorities had made them a simple, monstrous promise. Eat a piece of your leader's burned flesh, and you will live. Refuse, and you will join him on this platform immediately. They were about to learn that in these grand spectacles of punishment, everyone, eventually, becomes a participant. The executioner used his knife to cut away a charred piece of the burned tissue. He held it up high for the entire crowd to see, a tiny, terrible morsel, then turned to the first lieutenant. The man had gone 3 full days without food. His stomach had been cramping with hunger for hours. But this was his commander, his friend, the man he had sworn to follow into battle and into death. The crowd held its breath, 1,000 people frozen in a moment of collective horror. The lieutenant, his eyes wide with terror and desperation, slowly opened his mouth. What the crowd did next shocked even the seasoned executioners. Some people, caught in a frenzy, actually cheered. Others wept openly, great heaving sobs of shame and pity. A sudden fight broke out near the platform as a merchant, disgusted, attacked a man who had been laughing only moments before. Women fainted, collapsing to the ground. Children, sensing the shift, began to scream in genuine fear. The neat, orderly spectacle of power dissolved into utter chaos as the citizens of Budapest grappled with the profound horror of what they had just witnessed, what they had participated in merely by watching. The remaining lieutenants each faced the same unspeakable choice. Some bit down immediately, desperate to live, to see another sunrise. Others hesitated until guards pressed sharp sword points to their throats, forcing compliance. One man, his spirit broken but his conscience intact, refused entirely. They shot him in the chest with a crossbow without ceremony and threw his body unceremoniously off the platform. The crowd didn't cheer this time. They had had enough of this bloody entertainment. This was the central, inherent paradox of public castration. It was meant to terrorize, to warn, to unite the population against the very idea of rebellion. But push the spectacle too far, make it too elaborate, too sadistic, and the victims can transform into martyrs right before your eyes. Crowds that arrived to jeer and mock often left in a stunned, dangerous silence, carrying home new and subversive questions about the true nature of their rulers. The Hungarian nobles had wanted to make a definitive, unforgettable example of Gheorghe Doja. And in the end, they succeeded, just not in the way they had originally planned. The stories of his prolonged torture spread like wildfire across Europe, carried by traders and travelers. But in the telling and retelling, Doja himself transformed, morphing from a mere rebel into a folk hero, a martyr. He became the man who had endured the unendurable, the leader so feared and formidable that the state had to destroy him piece by piece in front of 1,000 witnesses. Other European kingdoms took careful note. Public castration as a political spectacle required extremely careful calibration. Too little cruelty, and it failed to inspire the necessary fear. Too much, and it could inspire something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Widespread sympathy. The Byzantines, in their wisdom, had always kept their castrations hidden away in palace basements. The Ottomans processed their boys in distant, anonymous provinces. But the European kingdoms, with their love of public drama, could never quite resist the dark appeal of punishment as mass entertainment. Town squares from London to Prague hosted similar, if slightly less elaborate, scenes over the centuries. Convicted rapists, captured enemy soldiers, political dissidents, all were subjected to the heated blade or the burning pincers while crowds gathered to watch. The very tools of the trade evolved into specialized instruments of public showmanship. Executioners actively competed to design more and more elaborate devices, spring-loaded castration clamps that could remove everything in one single dramatic motion, heated metal cups that cauterized as they cut, complex mechanical devices with gears and cranks that, perversely, let the crowd itself participate by turning the handles. It was torture disguised as technological innovation. But the most disturbing aspect of this entire system was not the escalating cruelty itself. It was the chilling, mundane bureaucracy that grew up around it. Cities appointed official, salaried castrators. They established detailed fee schedules: 2 florins for a simple, quick cut, 5 for the more painful burning method, 10 for the full, elaborate spectacle with multiple implements. They issued official licenses, collected taxes on the proceeds, and turned systematic mutilation into a standard municipal service. Venice, for example, kept a public castrator on a permanent city salary. His workshop sat in a bustling alley between the fish market and the customs house, marked only by a simple wooden sign depicting a knife and a flame. Citizens could even hire him for private punishments. Catch your wife with another man. For 15 ducats, the castrator would discreetly handle your problem. For a little extra, he would do it publicly. The records of this grim trade survive to this day. Leather-bound ledgers listing names, dates, methods, and fees collected in neat, looping script. Giovanni the merchant, castrated for defaulting on his loans. Paolo the thief, punished with hot pincers for stealing from the church. Marco the soldier, mutilated for the crime of desertion. Line after line, page after page of neat, bureaucratic entries, reducing human suffering and agony to simple, cold accounting. Some men, incredibly, survived these public ordeals. They became living, breathing warnings, forced to beg in the streets with their horrific scars permanently on display. Others found different, darker paths. The Church, in its paradoxical mercy, sometimes took in these castrated men, offering them sanctuary and specific roles as choir singers or scribes. Their high, pure voices, a direct physical product of their mutilation, became coveted assets in great cathedral choirs, a haunting, beautiful sound born from absolute brutality. The spectacle method reached its grotesque peak with the case of Robert-François d'Amiens in 1757. Accused of attempting to assassinate King Louis XV of France, he was sentenced to a spectacular, drawn-out public execution in the Place de Grève in Paris. But Damien was of noble blood, and his punishment had to befit his station, to become a grand theatrical lesson. The authorities commissioned a special device, gold-plated pincers, a silk cushion for him to kneel upon in his final moments. They even hired a small ensemble of court musicians to play elegant, refined music during the procedure, their delicate melodies mixing grotesquely with his agonized screams. The Parisian crowd, however, did not cheer. They watched in a profound, horrified silence as the golden pincers did their meticulous work, as the musicians played their careful compositions, as a nobleman bled and screamed just like any commoner. The message was chillingly clear. No one was safe. Not peasants, not merchants, not even the high-born lords. The absolute power of the state to unmake men extended to every single level of society. But even spectacle, as a tool of control, had its limits. You could only burn so much flesh before the crowds grew numb and stopped coming. You could only stage so many elaborate public mutilations before they began to lose their shocking, visceral impact. And there was another, more practical problem. Spectacle was inherently inefficient. It dealt with one man at a time, one crowd at a time. Some of the world's largest and most powerful empires needed castration to occur on a truly industrial, massive scale. While Europeans were perfecting the art of public horror, the Chinese emperors of the Ming and Qing dynasties had already industrialized castration into something far more vast. systematic, and sinister. In the shadow of the Forbidden City, they didn't need pincers or public platforms. They had built veritable factories for the mass production of eunuchs. The merchant counted the gold coins carefully, the metal cool and heavy in his palm, while his 8-year-old son bled and screamed in the very next room. 20 pieces of silver. That was the standard price, the going rate for a healthy, unblemished boy at the Beijing cutting houses in the 15th century. 20 pieces for a child who could read. 30 if he showed any precocious musical talent. The merchant's son, a bright boy, could do both. He was confident he could get 40, maybe even 45, if he haggled with the right mix of pride and desperation. The wooden sign outside the nondescript cutting house showed a simple, stark image. A knife crossed with a feather. Everyone in the entire district knew exactly what happened behind those perpetually closed red doors. Boys went in whole. Eunuchs came out, or if the procedure failed, small shrouded bodies were carried out the back. The survival rate, the merchant had heard, hovered around 60%. Those were grim, but apparently acceptable. Odds when your other 3 children at home were already starving, their bellies swollen with hunger. The merchant pocketed his coins, the transaction complete, and turned to leave without a single backward glance. His son's piercing, betrayed screams followed him out into the busy street, mixing horribly with the similar cries emanating from the other cutting rooms nearby. This was not a palace. This was not a medical facility. This was a factory, a processing plant for human beings. And business, it seemed, was absolutely booming. The cutting houses served as the indispensable processing facility in the middle, taking their fee from both ends. A few coins from the family for a so-called clean cut. 50 coins from the palace for each successful living delivery. The small bodies of the failures, the ones who did not survive, were unceremoniously taken to the lime pits out back. There were no refunds. The head cutter moved calmly between the tables, checking his assistant's work like a quality control inspector on a production line. Too deep a cut, and the boy would simply bleed out on the table. Too shallow, and infection would almost certainly set in, a slow septic death. The government manual, a thick sheaf of papers, specified exact measurements and procedures. Remove everything below the pubic bone. Cauterize with sand, heated to precisely 400 degrees. Insert the tube at a 30-degree angle. Bind the wound with silk strips, never cotton. Cotton holds bacteria. But here is what the sterile, official manual did not mention. What it could never capture, the boys who, in their terror, bit clean through their own tongues in an attempt to stop their screaming. The ones who begged for death, for any release, even before the cutting had even started. The new assistants who quit after their very first day, their sanity broken, unable to stomach the reality of the work. The head cutter had been doing this for 20 years. He had personally processed over 3,000 boys. He no longer even heard the screams. To him, they were just the ambient noise of industry. The contract the parents signed, their mark in shaky ink, always contained one specific, devastating clause that no one ever noticed until it was far too late. Should the procedure fail to produce a viable eunuch, the family agrees to provide a replacement child of equal or greater value. The translation was plain. If your son died on the table, you owed the cutting house another son, or even a daughter. The factories were not picky. Girls could be altered too, though that was considered specialty work, requiring a different, more delicate set of tools. The factory, to meet its relentless quotas, needed a constant, guaranteed supply of raw material. The ironclad contract guaranteed that supply. Some families, knowing the grim statistics, actually planned for this eventuality. They would bring 2 sons, hoping and praying that at least one would survive the ordeal. The cutting houses, ever the savvy businessmen, offered package deals. 2 boys for 35 pieces of silver, 3 for 50, volume discounts on human suffering. The clerks in the corner kept painstakingly careful records, their ledgers telling a story of industrialized misery. The Jiang family, 3 sons processed, 1 survivor. The Li family, 4 attempts, no successes, still owed 2 children to fulfill their contractual obligation. The building itself was a physical manifestation of this systemized mutilation. 3 functional floors. The ground floor was for the initial processing, 20 tables working in relentless shifts. The second floor was for recovery, where the survivors learned to manage their catheters and fought a daily battle against infection. The third floor was for training, because a merely castrated boy was just raw material. A trained, polished eunuch was a finished, valuable product. The training started while they still leaked fresh blood through their silk bandages. They were drilled in palace protocol, the proper forms of address, the 17 different ways to bow to different ranks of nobility. They learned how to modulate their new, changing voices to please their future masters. Mathematics for the boys, marked for the treasury. Beautiful calligraphy for the future scribes. Music theory and practice for those whose altered voices showed particular promise. They weren't just removing organs, they were systematically manufacturing an entire loyal servant class from the ground up. Inside the main cutting house, the selected boys were lined up like livestock at a market for final inspection. The selector, a man with a cold, appraising gaze, walked slowly down the line, checking teeth for health, examining hands for dexterity, listening to the tone and quality of their speaking voices. This one's fingers were too thick and clumsy for fine work. Rejected. This one had a lazy eye that might offend the nobility. Rejected. This one showed subtle signs of a past disease, a weakness in the lungs. Rejected. The rejects, however, did not get to go home. They were sent to the subcontractors, the back alley cutters who served the provincial nobility, where the survival rates were even lower, the prices were cheaper, and the standards were virtually non-existent. The selected boys, the chosen ones, had numbers quickly chalked onto their foreheads. 1 through 20 for the morning shift. 21 through 40 for the afternoon shift. The entire factory operated on a strict, unforgiving schedule. 8 minutes allocated per boy, including preparation and cleanup. 500 boys per month at the peak season. Spring was always the peak season. Families had just survived the harsh winter and were most desperate, most able to spare their extra mouths-to-feed sons. The cutting houses would hire additional temporary staff, work double shifts, and expand their operations into neighboring buildings to handle the increased flow of human raw material. The preparation room had a distinctive, unforgettable smell, a mix of sharp vinegar and palpable, human fear. The boys were stripped completely naked and scrubbed all over with harsh, stiff brushes until their skin turned raw and red. The assistants shaved every single hair from their bodies below the waist. Cleanliness, after all, reduced the risk of infection. And infection, in this business, ate directly into the profits. They tied each boy's hands and feet securely with strong silk rope. Hemp rope was cheaper, of course, but it had a tendency to leave noticeable, chafing marks on the skin, and marked, bruised goods sold for considerably less on the palace market. The cutting room itself had large windows facing east, designed to capture the best of the morning's natural light. Sunlight, they had found, allowed for cleaner, more precise cuts. The head cutter positioned each boy on the table with a mechanical, unvarying precision. Legs spread at a perfect 45-degree angle, lower back elevated exactly 4 inches by a wooden block, head turned firmly to the left to prevent him from choking on his own vomit. He had even written his own manual, titled The Efficient Method for Processing Palace Servants. The emperor himself, it was said, had once commended his systematic, disciplined approach. The cut itself, the moment of severance, took only 12 seconds. The subsequent cleanup and cauterization took 3 full minutes. The difference between life and death for these children often came down entirely to the skill displayed in those 3 frantic minutes. Press the hot sand against the wound too hard, and you risked damaging the delicate urethra beyond repair. Too soft, and the bleeding would not stop. The assistant had to skillfully pack the wound while the boy thrashed and bucked in agony. He had to insert the reed tube while the tissue was still swollen and traumatized. He had to wrap the silk strips tight enough to hold the dressings in place, but not so tight that they cut off all circulation and caused gangrene. It was a horrific, high-stakes balancing act. Those who somehow survived the cut and the immediate aftermath then faced something often worse than a quick death: the recovery room. This long, open hall stretched the entire length of the building. 50 simple beds, 50 boys in various, pitiful stages of healing or dying. The smell that hit any visitor was a physical force, a wall of stench, blood, pus, human waste, and underneath it all, the sweet, cloying stench of rotting flesh. Infection claimed most of them within the first 3 days. Their wounds would turn a foul green, then a necrotic black. Their fevers would spike, burning them up from the inside. In their delirium, they would call out for the mothers who had sold them, for the fathers who had willingly looked away. The lucky ones, the head cutter noted, went quickly. The survivors, however, discovered new, unique horrors. The tube had to be removed for cleaning twice a day, a mandatory, excruciating ritual. Each removal brought fresh, searing agony as the fragile, forming scabs were torn open anew. Some boys' urethras sealed shut despite the tube. They would swell grotesquely with retained urine until the assistants had to perform an emergency procedure, cutting a new, crude hole for the urine to escape. Others developed fistulas, leaking constantly through wounds that would never, ever fully heal. The cutting house, of course, charged extra for these medical complications. Extended recovery time meant extended fees, draining the family's resources even further. But the physical trauma, as immense as it was only the very beginning of their ordeal. You could watch a 9-year-old boy, his eyes hollow with understanding, slowly realize what had been permanently taken from him. Not just flesh, but his entire future. No wife, no children, no legacy, no respected place in the world of men. You could watch him learn that his voice would never break properly, that his body would develop in strange, alien ways, that every single person he would ever meet for the rest of his life would know instantly what he was, just by the sound of his voice, by his beardless face, by the way he walked. The cutting houses offered no comfort, no psychological support. Comfort did not produce capable, efficient eunuchs. Instead, they began a process of psychological conditioning, while the boys still wept from pain on their recovery beds. "You are special now," they would whisper. "You are chosen. You serve a higher, sacred purpose. The emperor himself will one day depend on your loyalty, your unique perspective." Normal men, with their base desires and ambitions, could never be trusted with such responsibility. Only you, purified through this necessary sacrifice, are worthy to fill this sacred role. Some of the boys, in their desperation, came to believe this lie. They had to. The alternative was accepting the unbearable truth that they had been mutilated for a handful of coins, processed like livestock for mere imperial convenience. It was far better for the mind's own survival to embrace the lie, to find a twisted sense of meaning in the horror. These true believers, in turn, became the very best eunuchs, the most loyal and efficient, the ones who would most fiercely defend the very system that had physically destroyed them. The factory's third floor housed the success stories, the finished products. Here, the boys who had survived the cutting, recovered from infection, and psychologically accepted their grim fate were polished and refined. Here, they learned to transform their profound trauma into marketable competence. Mathematics teachers drilled future palace accountants. Voice masters trained the singers to use their altered vocal cords to their fullest, most beautiful potential. Protocol instructors literally beat proper etiquette and obeisance into boys who had grown up in simple, rural farming villages. This final transformation, from broken victim to polished servant, took 3 full years. 3 years to turn a mutilated child into a valuable, functioning commodity. The cutting houses actually guaranteed their products. If a eunuch failed in his palace service within the first year, through disobedience, incompetence, or death, the house was contractually obligated to provide a replacement. Quality control, after all, mattered a great deal when your primary customer was the imperial court of China itself. Some boys, against all odds, not only survived, but excelled in this new life. Their names would later appear in the palace records as trusted advisors, brilliant administrators, talented artists, and even powerful military commanders. The cutting houses were always quick to claim credit for these stellar successes. "See what we have produced," they would boast. "See how our refined methods create excellence and loyalty." They never mentioned, wrapped their profound cruelty in the sterile language of medical terminology. They called it treatment, healing, rehabilitation. The prisoners, trapped in this nightmare, received detailed injection schedules like diabetics receiving insulin, a routine, medicalized, sanitized horror. Other compounds soon joined the synthetic estrogen, testosterone blockers, prolactin stimulators, experimental chemical cocktails that existed nowhere in the realm of legitimate medicine. The doctors, in a grotesque perversion of their oath, actively competed to develop more effective formulas, faster acting, longer lasting, more complete in their systematic destruction. They even published papers, attended conferences, and won accolades for their so-called innovative approaches to treating social deviancy. They had built a hell and called it a clinic. A single, fragile diary survived the war, hidden in a crack in the wall, discovered by chance during renovations 40 years later. Its pages told a story the official records never could. Week 8, the entry began. My voice cracked today. Not like a boy becoming a man, the reverse. I sound like my sister now. The guards laugh when I speak. Another entry, week 12, revealed the deepening horror. Hair fell out in clumps this morning. My chest swells with each injection. I look in the mirror and see a stranger. I remember who I was, but I can no longer reconcile that man with the thing I am becoming. By week 20, the entries turned existential. They say the treatment is working, that I am cured of my affliction. But I feel nothing. Not for men, not for women, not for life itself. Is this emptiness truly better than desire? Is this their cure? The entries grew shorter as the months bled into one another, becoming harder to read, not because of poor penmanship, but because of the utter degradation of the will behind the words. The man who had filled pages with fierce resistance in the early weeks was reduced to stark, single lines by the end. Injection today. More changes. Still alive. The final entry was just a date, a number scrawled on the page. Nothing else was worth recording. But the profound, heartbreaking fact remained. Until the very end, he had kept writing. Others in the program lost far more than their bodies. The psychological destruction followed chillingly predictable patterns. First came denial. This is temporary, reversible, a nightmare that must end. Then, bargaining. If I cooperate, if I show progress, they will stop the injections. Then a burning righteous rage. But rage requires testosterone, a fire that needs fuel, and the chemicals had systematically stolen that too. What remained was not peace, but a hollow, chilling acceptance, an absence, a void where a person once lived. The doctors, in their monstrous ignorance, considered this very absence a resounding success. Look how calm they have become, they would note. How compliant. No more deviant desires, because they have no desires at all. They had created chemical eunuchs, walking ghosts who had once been men with passions and loves, perfect, placid citizens for the new order. Sexless, passionless, empty vessels waiting for the state to fill them. Yet this dark marriage of chemistry and control was not a Nazi invention. Ancient acids, for instance, worked far faster but achieved the same gruesome result. Persian torturers had discovered centuries earlier that certain compounds could burn through flesh as efficiently as any blade. A mixture of sulfuric acid and salt. Lime dissolved in strong wine. Pour it onto the body and watch as the very anatomy that defined manhood dissolved into a screaming, bubbling mass. The screaming always lasted longer than with a cutting, but the end result was perfectly identical. Everything that marked a man was eaten away, consumed by a voracious chemistry. The medieval Arabs, brilliant alchemists, further refined these techniques because they refined everything. Their advanced treatises on medicine and chemistry even included specific chapters on chemical castration to be used when the knife is impractical. For when the risk of infection was too high, for when you needed to process many subjects with brutal efficiency, the instructions were precise. Mix 3 parts acid with 1 part honey. The honey makes it stick. Apply liberally. Wait for the screaming to stop. They tested different formulas on condemned prisoners, noting the results with detached curiosity. This mixture ate through flesh in minutes, but left too much scarring. That one worked slower, but produced a cleaner result. They even developed specialized applicator tools, glass funnels, ceramic tubes, ways to direct the corrosive liquid precisely where it needed to go. Even chemical castration, in their hands, had become a dark and exact science. The Nazis had merely modernized this ancient cruelty, gifting it schedules and forms in triplicate. Their hormone program rapidly expanded beyond homosexuals to include political prisoners who showed insufficient masculine aggression, mental patients whose sexuality was deemed a threat to the social order, and even some Jewish prisoners, because the racial scientists wondered if chemical castration might somehow breed the Jewishness out of them, rendering them docile and controllable. To be less than a man meant to be less than human, which meant to be less than problematic. Each injection, each charted reaction, refined their methods. Increase this compound to accelerate breast growth. Add that one to ensure complete impotence. Adjust dosages based on body weight and age. They discovered that younger subjects responded faster, their bodies more pliable, more easily reshaped by the chemical onslaught. Some doctors began to specialize in adolescence, aiming to catch them before full development, preventing masculinity rather than merely removing it. The medical staff held weekly conferences, presenting their grim findings with clinical slides and neat charts. Subject groups A through E showed these results. Control group F maintained for comparison. They discussed side effects with the bland tone of accountants, liver damage in 30% of subjects, bone density loss in 45%, severe suicidal depression in 70%. These were, in their eyes, acceptable losses for the grand project of social hygiene. But chemistry allowed for something the knife never could: the illusion of reversibility, or at least the cruel promise of it. Cooperate, and we will stop the injections. Inform on other deviants, and perhaps your body will recover. They dangled this shred of hope like bait before broken men, all the while knowing the terrible truth. After 6 months, the changes became permanent. After a year, they were utterly irreversible. Yet desperate men will believe anything, and they will betray anyone for the chance to feel whole again. The program thus produced informants by the dozen, men who would betray their lovers, their friends, themselves, for just one day without the needle. One day to feel something, anything, other than the chemical emptiness. The doctors noted this too, with cold interest. Subjects show markedly increased cooperation after month 4. Useful for intelligence gathering, recommend expanding the program. The poison developed in those German medical rooms did not stay within its borders. It seeped out, and other nations took notice. The concept of chemical castration began its migration as a criminal punishment, as a treatment for sex offenders, even as voluntary therapy for those who feared their own desires. The language changed, softened, became thoroughly medicalized, but the core, ancient goal remained identical. Using chemistry to unmake men, to strip them of their fundamental nature. The modern programs use different, cleaner-sounding drugs now. Depo-Provera, cyproterone acetate, Leuprolide. Pristine names for sterile injections that achieve the same ancient ends. We have abandoned the public spectacle, the heated pincers, the trained animals. Now it happens in quiet, bright medical facilities, accompanied by consent forms and detailed treatment plans. They call this progress. They call it a humane alternative to imprisonment. Yet the testimonies of the men who submit to modern chemical castration echo with an uncanny resonance, the desperate words from that Nazi-era diary. They speak of a loss of self, of an emptiness where desire once lived, of bodies that no longer feel like home. But it is voluntary, the courts insist. A choice between a prison of concrete and a prison of chemistry. Some choice. The true, insidious horror of chemical castration lies not in its overt brutality, but in its chilling banality. There are no screaming crowds, no blood-soaked platforms, just quiet rooms, careful doses, and the slow, inexorable dissolution of everything that makes a man feel alive. The ancients, at least, had the courage to acknowledge their cruelty. We hide ours in medical journals and call it progress. But even chemistry required a degree of sophistication, equipment, and training. Some cultures, embodying a terrifying pragmatism, found far simpler ways. Why bother mixing complex acids when you had horses? Why develop intricate formulas when pure, unadulterated physical force achieved the same results? In the vast steppes of Mongolia, they had perfected castration through crushing, and they did not need a single blade to do it. The Mongol warrior positioned the heavy wooden board across the prisoner's pelvis and whistled, a sharp, commanding sound, for his horse. The Chinese rebel, a man who had led daring raids against Mongol tax collectors for 3 months, now lay spread-eagled on the frozen ground outside Karakoram. He was about to learn why the great Khan's justice traveled on horseback. 4 iron-shod stakes pinned his limbs to the earth. Rough hemp ropes cut deep into his wrists and ankles. The board across his groin was 2 inches thick, sturdy oak, reinforced with iron bands, built to focus immense pressure, built to last through multiple, gruesome uses. The horse approached at a steady, deliberate walk. It was a war stallion, 16 hands high, over 1,200 pounds of pure, trained muscle. Its heavy hooves left deep, crisp prints in the frost-hardened earth. The handlers had done this countless times before. The board was engineered to focus every single pound of that immense weight precisely where the Mongols wanted maximum, irreversible damage. The physics were brutally simple. 1,200 pounds concentrated onto a 2-foot section of unyielding hardwood. The board would distribute the weight across the pelvis while channeling the crushing force directly onto the genitals trapped beneath. No cutting, no burning, just pressure, steadily increasing until something vital gave way. That something was always flesh and bone. The rebel tried desperately to arch his back, to create even a sliver of space between his body and the oppressive wood. The stakes held him flat, immobile. He had watched other men undergo this punishment, had heard their screams carry for miles across the open steppe. Now his turn had come, and his understanding of the mechanics only made the terror worse, knowing exactly what would happen, when it would happen, and how long it would take. The handler guided his horse with subtle, practiced pressure. Step here. Now here. The stallion's front hoof touched the board's edge. The wood let out a low, ominous creak. The rebel's breathing turned shallow, coming in quick, frantic gasps that fogged in the cold morning air. The watching Mongol officers nodded with approval. This was how you broke a rebellion. Not through a quick death, but through a memorable, soul-shattering destruction. Then, the horse stepped fully onto the board. The scream that erupted from the rebel could be heard in the next valley. It was a sound of pure, animal agony that sent birds exploding from nearby trees. His body convulsed violently against his bonds, every muscle straining, tendons standing out like ropes, but the stakes held, the board held. The horse stood, patient, trained to remain perfectly motionless despite the frantic thrashing beneath its hooves. But it was the other sound that truly echoed across the steppe, a sound like thunder announcing a storm. Not the scream, that was expected, but the wet, sickening crunch of tissues compressing beyond their limits, the muffled pop of things rupturing deep inside, the grinding of solid oak against pelvic bone. These sounds carried their own unmistakable message to anyone within earshot. This is what defiance brings. This is the price of rebellion against the Great Khan. The handler let the horse stand for exactly 30 seconds, long enough for complete, irreversible destruction, but not long enough for immediate death. The Mongols had perfected this timing through decades of grim practice. They knew precisely how long the bones could bear the weight before breaking, how much soft tissue could be compressed before major vessels ruptured. They wanted casualties, not corpses, living, breathing warnings. The horse then stepped off. The board was lifted away, revealing what no longer resembled human anatomy. The rebel had mercifully lost consciousness, his body finally granting him escape from a sensation too extreme to process. Dark blood pooled beneath him, but not the bright arterial spray that meant quick death. The Mongols knew their craft. What remained of his manhood was often displayed on pikes for weeks outside the nearest settlement. Not the man himself. He would be left to die slowly or survive, permanently maimed, depending on his constitution. But the destroyed flesh, preserved in salt, was mounted on sharpened poles. It was a warning written in a language of ruined tissue. The Mongols didn't need words when they had such an explicit, visual vocabulary. Every merchant who passed, every farmer who brought his goods to market, understood the message perfectly. The crushing method offered stark advantages over cutting or burning. It required no surgical skill, only basic horsemanship. There were no special tools that could break or dull, no fire to tend, no acids to mix. Just horses and boards and the sheer, brutal weight of consequence. An army on the move could carry out dozens of such punishments without ever slowing its relentless advance. The Mongols even refined the technique for different crimes. Simple tax evasion might earn a single decisive step. Direct rebellion brought repeated, methodical crushing, walking the horse back and forth across the board, each pass systematically destroying what the previous one had left intact. For the very worst offenders, they used multiple horses. 2, 3. Sometimes an entire mounted unit would take turns. The ground beneath would churn into a bloody, horrific mud. But for them, efficiency always mattered more than creativity. The standard method took just 2 minutes from positioning to completion. Compare that to the hour-long spectacles in European squares. or the careful, protracted surgery in Byzantine chambers. The Mongols could process a dozen rebels in the time it took Hungarian executioners to merely heat their pincers. This was punishment as pure military tactic, swift, scalable, and utterly terrifying. The psychological impact rippled outward from each demonstration. Villages that witnessed a crushing punishment paid their taxes early. Rebellious thoughts died unspoken. The mere sight of Mongol cavalry approaching with their boards and stakes was enough to end most potential uprisings before they began. Why fight when you knew with chilling certainty what defeat meant? It was better to submit with your body intact than to resist and face the horse. The Mongols, ever the meticulous strategists, documented their methods with characteristic precision. The Khan's scribes recorded optimal board dimensions, the best wood types for different climates, oak for cold regions, teak for humid ones, and detailed horse training regimens that produced animals who wouldn't shy away from their grim work. Even the precise placement of the stakes mattered. Too close together, and the victim could arch his back. Too far apart, and the ropes might allow too much movement. Every single detail was refined through ruthless repetition. Some men incredibly did survive. They became living reminders, wandering like ghosts between settlements, unable to work, unable to father children, dependent on the charity of people who could not bear to look directly at their injuries. The Mongols sometimes provided these survivors with a little food and a few copper coins. This was not born of mercy. They wanted them visible, mobile warnings that were far more effective than any written proclamation. The crushing method spread like a shadow along the Silk Road and other trade routes. Persian armies adopted it for battlefield punishments. Chinese warlords used it against their captured enemies. The technique required no cultural translation. Pain was a universal language. Destruction needed no interpreter. A board and a horse meant the same thing from Kiev to Kathmandu. Yet even the Mongols recognized there were limits. Crush too many men, and you had no one left to rule. Dead men paid no taxes. Maimed men could not work the fields or tend the herds. The balance between fear and functionality required careful, cold calculation. Too little punishment, and rebellion festered. Too much, and the local economy collapsed. The Khan's advisors developed quotas, no more than one public crushing per 1,000 citizens per year. It was enough to maintain order, but not enough to cripple productivity. The method evolved with technology. They found that iron-shod hooves concentrated pressure more effectively than bare ones. They designed specialized boards with ridges and channels to increase soft tissue damage while reducing the rate of immediate death. Some commanders experimented with different animals. Oxen moved slower but weighed more. Elephants, in regions where they were available, could destroy multiple prisoners simultaneously. But the horse remained the standard, common, trainable, and a portable instrument of terror. Every method explored so far was a violence inflicted by an enemy upon a victim. But history reveals a final, bewildering twist. Some men, in the throes of religious ecstasy, did this to themselves. They were not victims, but volunteers in what remains one of history's most strange and terrifying practices. The drums pounded like 1,000 frantic heartbeats as torchlight flickered across a sea of painted, ecstatic faces. In the great temple courtyard at Pessinus, 300 men danced themselves into a collective frenzy. Their white robes spun in dizzying circles, bare feet slapping against cold stone, voices rising in ancient hypnotic hymns to Cybele, the Great Mother. And at the very center of the altar, freshly sharpened blades gleamed on silver platters. This was not a forced castration in a palace basement or a public square. These men had traveled hundreds of miles by choice to be here. Merchants who had sold their shops, soldiers who had abandoned their posts, farmers who had left their fields unharvested. They came seeking a radical transformation, a rebirth through the blade. They were not victims, but willing participants in a sacred, terrifying ritual, the festival of Dies Sanguinis, the Day of Blood. This was the day when men would offer their very manhood to the goddess and become something else entirely. The Romans who had conquered this region watched from the edges of the courtyard, fascinated and profoundly horrified. They had seen battlefield mutilation and public punishment, but this willing self-destruction in a state of religious ecstasy, defied all Roman logic and understanding. The first devotee stepped forward. He was 23 years old, a potter from Antioch. He had dreamed of this moment for months, the goddess calling to him in visions, promising a power beyond male limitations, a wisdom beyond human comprehension. All he had to do was sacrifice the very thing that made him a man. He took the blade with steady, sure hands. The crowd began to chant, low at first, a rumble like distant thunder. The drums resumed, faster now, their driving rhythms bypassing all thought and speaking directly to the blood. The potter's eyes rolled back in his head. His body began to sway, possessed by the rhythm. The other devotees pressed closer, their voices joining the chant, building, accelerating, creating a solid wall of sound that drowned out all doubt, all fear. What happened next would have shocked even the temple priests, and they had seen this dozens of times. The potter did not make a careful cut. He slashed. One violent, sweeping motion that sent a dark arc of blood spraying across the pristine, white robes of those nearby. Then, with a look of transcendent triumph, he held his severed flesh high above his head, the tissue still connected by stringy sinew. And the crowd erupted, not in horror, but in wild celebration, in fervent envy. The other devotees surged forward, hands desperately reaching for the platters, for their own moment of transformation. The frenzy spread through the crowd like a spiritual wildfire. The second man, a banker from Damascus who had given away his entire fortune to be here, barely waited for the first to step aside. His cut was precise, almost practiced. He had rehearsed this moment in private, wanting to do it right, to honor the goddess properly. The blade moved in a careful, deliberate arc, and his offering joined the growing pile upon the altar. But such precision quickly gave way to raw, unbridled passion. As more and more men pressed forward, they fed off each other's manic energy. Each act of self-mutilation drove the next to greater, more reckless extremes. Some cut too deep, severing arteries along with the flesh. They collapsed into spreading crimson pools while the sacred dance continued, unfazed around them. Others cut too shallow, requiring multiple agonizing attempts. Their screams of pain now mixed with the ecstatic cries of those who had succeeded. The temple priests moved through the chaos with a practiced, grim efficiency, cauterizing wounds with heated bronze rods, dragging away those who had lost too much blood to survive. They had prepared for this. They had stockpiled bandages and wine, set up recovery areas in the temple's back chambers. The Day of Blood always claimed its victims alongside its volunteers. One young man, barely 16, hesitated at the altar. The blade trembled violently in his grip. All around him, the frenzy was reaching its peak. Men were dancing with blood streaming down their legs. Others had already collapsed, lost in religious ecstasy or deep shock. The drums pounded ever faster. The chants grew to a deafening roar, and still he hesitated. An older priest, a eunuch himself, castrated in this very courtyard 20 years prior, approached him. He placed gentle hands on the boy's shaking shoulders and whispered something into his ear. The words were lost in the overwhelming noise, but the boy's face changed in an instant. Terror was replaced by a fierce, fanatical determination. He raised the blade high and then brought it down, They threw their severed flesh onto the altar while they were still conscious. The offerings piled up, dozens of pieces of humanity sacrificed to a divine madness. The altar's white marble turned a deep, dark crimson. The air grew thick with the coppery scent of catastrophic wounds, mixed with the heavy smoke of incense and the smell of human sweat. Some men, after throwing their offering, immediately collapsed. Others continued their bloody dance, the combination of massive blood loss and religious ecstasy creating powerful visions of the goddess herself walking among them. The Romans, watching from the edges, had seen enough. They had come expecting barbarism, but they had found something far more disturbing. Voluntary mutilation, joyful self-destruction. These weren't enemies being punished or slaves being processed. These were free men, Roman citizens in some cases, choosing the blade, celebrating their own unmanning. It challenged the very bedrock of everything Roman masculinity stood for. But what came after the cutting was, for the Romans, even harder to comprehend. The survivors woke in the temple's recovery chambers transformed. Not just physically, though the changes were immediate and obvious. The high voices, the smooth cheeks that would never grow beards, the bodies that would now develop in different, softer patterns. But the psychological transformation went infinitely deeper. They spoke of powerful visions during their ecstasy, of the goddess entering them through their open wounds, of a knowledge beyond male understanding flooding their newly emptied bodies. They became the Galli, beings who were neither male nor female, but something entirely outside of normal human categories. They began to wear women's clothing and ornate jewelry, but often kept their male names. They grew their hair long and painted their faces in elaborate patterns, yet sometimes walked with an unchanged masculine stride. Roman law, rigid and binary, did not know what to do with them. Legal codes specified certain rights and punishments for men and different ones for women. The Galli fit neatly into neither category. In the service of the goddess, however, they found a power that intact men could never access. They became renowned as prophets and healers, their high, piercing voices believed to carry divine messages. Rich Romans, even those who publicly mocked the castrated priests, would often seek their blessings in private. Women especially were drawn to them, believing the Galli understood female mysteries that normal men could never grasp. They walked the streets in colorful, flowing robes, collecting alms and offering prophecies. Their very appearance announced their sacrifice: smooth faces painted white, eyes ringed with kohl, elaborate headdresses that jingled with every step. They were living, breathing reminders that some men valued a direct, divine connection over earthly masculinity and its privileges. The temple provided for all their needs: food, shelter, and most importantly, a powerful sense of purpose. In exchange, they served as eternal intermediaries between the goddess and her worshippers. They led her rituals, interpreted dreams, blessed marriages, and cursed enemies. Their very sexlessness became the source of their perceived power. After all, who could possibly corrupt a priest who had no earthly desires? Who could seduce someone who had already given everything to their deity? But beneath the layer of religious ecstasy lay darker, more human truths. Many who took the blade in the heat of frenzy came to regret it deeply when the madness passed and the calm of reality set in. The temple's back rooms housed those who had tried to kill themselves in the aftermath, who had realized too late the permanence of what they had sacrificed. The goddess might fill a spiritual void, but she could not restore what the knife had taken. Some of the Galli fled the temple, attempting to return to their old normal lives. But where could they go? Their families often refused to acknowledge them. They were neither son nor daughter, neither brother nor sister. They existed in a social limbo, marked forever by their voices and their faces as something outside of all acceptable categories. Many, with nowhere else to turn, eventually drifted back to the temple, simply because nowhere else in the world would have them. The Roman state, deeply unsettled, tried repeatedly to ban the practice. It was too disruptive, too dangerous, and far too appealing to young men seeking a dramatic escape from military service or stifling family obligations. But the cult of Cybele spread anyway, its appeal irresistible. Temples to the Great Mother appeared in cities across the empire. Each spring brought a new day of blood, new volunteers, new sacrifices to this divine madness. What drove men to this voluntary castration became a subject of intense fascination for Roman philosophers and historians. Was it genuine, overpowering religious devotion? The immense social pressure within the cult? Or was it a kind of contagious, collective insanity that spread through the crowd like a plague? They interviewed former Galli, trying to piece together an answer. The responses varied wildly. Some spoke of irresistible, divine commands that left no room for refusal. Others admitted with shame to being swept up in the moment, acting before thought was possible. In the end, the mystery remained. The ultimate, terrifying power of an idea, a belief so potent that it could convince a man to willingly destroy his own body, to offer the very essence of his masculinity upon the altar of faith. A few of the Galli, when pressed by Roman philosophers, claimed they had always felt profoundly wrong in their male bodies, and that the goddess Cybele offered them their only possible escape. The practice, in response to Roman pressure, evolved over time. Later, temples instituted safeguards. Potential devotees were now required to wait a full year between declaring their intention and being permitted to take the blade. It was a year to consider, a year to withdraw. But for the true believers, this delay only intensified their fervent desire. They spent the waiting year in rigorous preparation, fasting, praying, mentally rehearsing the moment of their ultimate transformation. Yet, whether the cutting came by knife, by fire, or by religious frenzy, the act itself was merely the beginning. The real, enduring torture lasted a lifetime. 40 years after his castration, the old eunuch still could not urinate standing up. The familiar bronze tube pressed against his scarred and sensitive flesh, directing a weak, humiliating stream into a ceramic pot that he was forced to empty 6 times daily. 6 separate occasions of fumbling with his robes, of positioning the awkward device, of fighting a deep, cellular shame that had never, ever faded. The palace guards, young and whole, still snickered when he shuffled past, carrying his pot to the latrines. 40 years, and they still found his fundamental brokenness a source of amusement. His name had been Marcus once. Now they called him Whisper, a name that mocked the reedy feminine voice that emerged from his throat, a sound like wind through dry reeds. He served wine at imperial banquets, a figure of pure invisibility, noticed only when a senator's cup needed refilling. The powerful men spoke freely around him, discussing matters of state and secrets of the bedchamber. What secrets could a sexless thing possibly spill? What threat could a creature who had to squat to piss ever truly pose? His morning routine never varied. He woke before dawn in the eunuch's quarters, a long, barren hall filled with narrow beds and the sounds of other damaged men struggling through troubled sleep. His first task was always to check the tube for blockages. Infections had killed more eunuchs over the years than the initial cutting ever had. He would then clean the scarred area with sharp vinegar, wincing at the sting, a daily, painful reminder of what was no longer there. Finally, he would wrap himself in the loose, flowing robes designed to hide the changing topography of his body. 40 years on, his hips had widened like a woman's. Soft, unwanted breasts hung beneath the fabric. Every single morning was a rehearsal of the same profound humiliation. The younger eunuchs pretended not to watch as he prepared for the day, but he knew they were learning from his silent suffering. Give them a decade, and they would move with the same shuffling care, fighting their own constant leakage and the infections that flared without warning. The lucky ones died within 5 years. The unlucky ones, like Marcus, lived long enough to see their bodies become entirely alien landscapes. He remembered his first week after the cutting, the fever dreams where he still felt whole, waking to reach for what was no longer there, the phantom sensations, a cruelty sharper than any blade. The physician had promised the tube would be temporary, just until the healing was complete. 40 years later, he still needed it. The scar tissue had grown wrong, sealing passages that nature had intended to stay open. The physical agony had long since faded into a mere, constant discomfort. Raw, weeping wounds had hardened into numb, thick scars. The missing weight between his legs had stopped feeling like a screaming absence and had become a simple, awful fact. But other pains persisted relentlessly, the deep bone aches that came from a body producing no testosterone, the crippling headaches born of permanent hormonal chaos, the pervasive weakness that made carrying heavy wine jugs an exhausting ordeal. Still, the body's myriad betrayals were nothing compared to the treachery of the mind. Marcus would sometimes catch his reflection in a polished bronze shield and instantly look away. The face staring back was not the captured Roman soldier of 19. It was a face with soft cheeks where stubble should grow, lines around eyes that had seen too much, and a mouth that had forgotten how to form a genuine smile. He was 59 years old, and he looked both ancient and unnervingly childlike. The living contradiction of eunuch aging, never fully adult, never truly old, forever suspended between states, just as their bodies were suspended between sexes. The palace dining hall filled with other damaged men. 300 eunuchs served the complex, each carrying his own private version of Marcus's morning routine. Some hid their tubes better than others. The younger ones, processed through the more refined Chinese cutting houses, had neater scars, more precise damage. They could sometimes, if they kept their voices low, almost pass for intact men. The older Byzantine cuts, like Marcus, were obvious, butchery masquerading as surgery. They ate in a heavy, shared silence. What was there to discuss? Their collective shame. The way citizens crossed the street to avoid them. The children who threw stones and called them half-men. It was better to focus solely on the bread and watered wine, on the mechanical act of surviving another day in bodies that had betrayed them, and minds that would never, ever let them forget. The phantom pains never stopped, even decades later. Marcus still felt it sometimes, the ghostly weight that should hang between his legs, the sensation of something moving that could not move because it was gone. Physicians called it a memory of the flesh, the body's stubborn recollection of its original, complete state. He would wake in the night, grasping for anatomy that existed only in dreams, and the absence would hit him with a freshness that rivaled that first morning when he had looked down at the bloody bandages and finally understood what 30 pieces of gold had bought his father. Other eunuchs reported different phantoms, a burning where the cauterizing iron had pressed, a pulling sensation where the knife had sawed. One man swore he could still feel his severed parts, could point to the exact empty space in the air where they should be hanging. The mind's cruelty, it seemed, exceeded that of any torturer. At least torturers eventually stopped. The phantom pains came without warning, a lifetime sentence. 40 years later, they could feel as fresh as the first day. The psychological damage ran infinitely deeper than the missing flesh. Marcus had tried to kill himself 3 times in that first shattering year. The palace guards found him with stolen rope, with hoarded poison, with a kitchen knife pressed against his own wrists. They stopped him each time, not from any place of mercy, but because a dead eunuch could not serve wine, could not demonstrate the emperor's absolute power over the human form, could not serve as a living reminder to intact men of the price of defiance. They assigned him to the kitchens first. Safe, simple work for a broken boy learning to navigate his new body. He dropped plates when phantom pain struck without warning, collapsed when infections flared. The other kitchen slaves gave him a wide berth, as if his mutilation were contagious, his shame a stain that could spread. Better to let him work alone, this thing that was not quite human anymore. The cruelest mockery often came from those they served, and the senators' wives were the very worst. They would specifically demand he serve at their private gatherings, giggling behind painted silk fans at his high voice, deliberately making him reach for items on high shelves just to observe the unnatural way his body moved. Neither male nor female, he was an uncanny, walking middle that served as entertainment for bored patrician women. They would ask him brazen, intimate questions. Does it still hurt? Can you feel anything down there? What is it like to be neither one thing nor the other? They would laugh at his stuttering, flustered attempts to deflect, to maintain the servant's cloak of invisibility. The men were different. They ignored him completely, their eyes sliding past him as if he were a piece of furniture. Their conversations, brimming with state secrets, military plans, assassination plots, would continue unabated, because what could a eunuch possibly do? Who would ever listen to a half-man's warning? This invisibility was supposed to be his source of power, access to information that intact men would kill to obtain. But information without any agency was merely a burden. It was the agony of knowing terrible secrets he could never act upon, of hearing fateful plans he was powerless to change. Marcus had watched 3 separate emperors rise and fall from his silent post, pouring wine. He had heard the conspiracies forming in their earliest whispers. He knew which senators would betray their oaths, which generals would raise their banners in rebellion. And he had said nothing, done nothing. What credibility did a creature who urinated through a tube possess? What influence could someone who was neither man nor woman ever hope to wield? The younger eunuchs still spoke in hushed, hopeful tones of advancement, of legendary eunuchs who had risen to command legions, amass vast fortunes, and whisper directly into imperial ears. Marcus let them have their dreams. It was better than explaining the crushing reality, how few ever achieved such heights, how most spent decades, as he had, as invisible servants in bodies that daily screamed of their incompleteness, how the lucky ones died young, and the unlucky ones survived to become walking, breathing cautionary tales. The suicide rate told the real, grim story. Of the 20 boys castrated in Marcus's group, 6 had died on the table. 4 more had perished within the first month from raging infection. Of the 10 survivors, 7 had killed themselves within 5 years. 1 had simply disappeared, likely dead in some alley. That left only Marcus and Quintus had finally found the courage to drown himself last winter, walking into the icy Tiber with stones sewn into his robes. In his darkest moments, Marcus envied him that final, decisive act. New eunuchs arrived monthly, fresh cuts from Constantinople, Baghdad, and Beijing. They were boys with bandages that still wept, learning to walk with tubes, their voices cracking into permanent, higher registers. Marcus watched them struggle through the same, predictable stages he knew so well. Denial, rage, bargaining with gods who had long since abandoned them, and a depression that settled like a permanent fog, never to lift. What passed for acceptance was not peace, but simply exhaustion. He could predict which ones would survive. Not the fighters. They burned out too fast, their rage consuming them from the inside. Not the weepers. They would find a rope or poison within the year. The survivors were the ones who went quiet early, who accepted their mutilation as an unchangeable fact of life. Like the weather, who learned to navigate their new bodies without any hope of wholeness, who discovered that an existence without dignity was, technically, still an existence, but even successful adaptation meant a half-life. Marcus had learned to hide his tube beneath layers of robes, had trained his voice to remain as steady as possible despite its feminine pitch, had developed meticulous routines that minimized the risk of infection. He could pour wine without spilling a drop, serve multi-course meals without drawing a single glance, fade into palace backgrounds like a piece of expensive functional furniture. He had mastered the art of being nothing. The cost of this mastery was everything that made a life worth living. No lovers who could ever want a body missing its very defining features. No friends. Other eunuchs were only reminders of his own shame, and intact men saw him as neither threat nor equal. No family. His parents had sold him, and his siblings pretended he had died on some forgotten battlefield. He had no future beyond serving wine until his hands shook too much to hold the pitcher steady. The nights were always the worst, alone in the dark, with a body that felt profoundly wrong, and the haunting memories of wholeness. The younger eunuchs still wept softly in their beds. Marcus had no tears left. He had only the familiar heavy weight of absence, the cold press of the tube against scarred flesh, the phantom pains that struck without mercy, and the certain knowledge that tomorrow would bring the exact same routine. Wake, clean, wrap, serve, sleep, and repeat until death finally claimed what the knife had only begun. He had considered running away. Some eunuchs did escape, fleeing to distant provinces where their unusual voices might pass unnoticed. But running required a shred of hope, a belief that somewhere in the vast world, a place existed where his mutilation would not utterly define him. Marcus had lost that belief decades ago. The empire was vast, but it was not vast enough to outrun what you carried between your legs, or in his case, what you did not. So he stayed. He poured the wine. He listened to the secrets. He watched intact men plan, scheme, and rut, while he stood invisible in the corner. They commanded legions. He commanded nothing, not even his own bladder. They worried about glory and legacy. He worried about infections and keeping his tube clean. They lived. He merely existed. Yet, despite this living hell, history shows us that some eunuchs did indeed rise to control entire empires. Narses counted the gold coins, while Constantinople smoldered outside his window. 500,000 solidi, enough to buy entire provinces, enough to rebuild the charred districts of the city. The eunuch general tucked the immense fortune into silk bags, his movements precise and calm despite the screams of the rioters echoing through the marble halls. Emperor Justinian desperately needed this gold to buy off the violent mob, and only Narses, the castrated former slave, had the unwavering access to the imperial treasury. The man who could never father children had become the father to an empire's very survival. The paradox should have been obvious from the start. Give ultimate power to those who could never, ever pass it on to sons. Trust your deepest, most dangerous secrets to men who existed entirely outside of normal society. Create a ruling class from the systematically mutilated. It took centuries for kingdoms to fully realize what they had accidentally created. Not victims, not merely broken servants, but the perfect political weapons. Narses had been cut at age 12 in a dusty Armenian slave market. Now at 60, he commanded the finest legions of Rome. His high voice had once marked him for mockery. Now, that same voice made hardened, battle-scarred generals snap instantly to attention. The scarred flesh between his legs had barred him from dynasty building. That very lack made him the one man Justinian could trust absolutely. Kings learned to trust only those who could never, ever claim the throne for themselves. The logic was as ruthless as it was simple. An intact advisor might plot to replace you, might seduce your wife, corrupt your heirs, build powerful alliances through marriage. But a eunuch? His ambitions had inherent biological limits. He could accumulate immense power, but never pass it on. He could amass staggering wealth, but never found a royal house. He could whisper in the royal ear, but never threaten the sacred bloodline. Basil the Macedonian learned this lesson in blood. His most trusted general, an intact man with 3 ambitious sons, had tried to usurp the Byzantine throne. Basil survived, but only barely, and from that day forward he vowed, never again. His new decree was absolute. Only eunuchs could hold the highest offices of state: chancellor, keeper of the treasury, military commander. The most powerful positions in the entire empire were now reserved exclusively for men, missing the very equipment required for dynasty. The Chinese had perfected this system centuries before Byzantium even discovered it. The Forbidden City ran on a bureaucracy of eunuch administrators. 3,000 castrated men managed everything from the collection of taxes to the supply of entire armies. The emperor could sleep peacefully, knowing his servants' loyalty was guaranteed, not by oath, but by what they physically lacked. No pillow talk with wives who might have ambitions of their own. No sons to place in strategic positions. Just pure, undiluted service to the throne that fed and clothed them. Zheng He counted his fleet while sailors loaded treasure ships. 400 vessels, 27,000 men. The largest naval expedition in human history, and a eunuch commanded every single ship. The Chinese admiral had been castrated as a boy, captured in war, and processed through the usual brutal channels. Now, he alone decided the trade routes that would shape the destiny of Asia for centuries to come. The very mutilation that had destroyed them became the foundation of their power. Think about it from the emperor's perspective. You need someone to command your vast armies. An intact general might turn those very armies against you. He might decide his own sword gives him more right to rule than your royal blood. But a eunuch general? The soldiers would follow his tactical brilliance, but they would never, ever accept him as emperor. His authority flowed solely from you, and it ended with you. It was perfect. The same ruthless logic applied everywhere. Eunuch tax collectors could not be bribed with promises of marriage alliances. Eunuch judges could not be swayed by the pretty daughters of plaintiffs. Eunuch spies could move freely through harems and bathhouses, invisible to those who saw them as mere sexless furniture. Every missing piece of anatomy became a unique qualification for positions of power that intact men could never be trusted to hold. And so, power accumulated in these mutilated men in the most unexpected ways. Eunuchs controlled the flow of information in nearly every palace. Every document passed through their hands. Every whispered conversation eventually reached their ears. They stood behind thrones during audiences, beside the royal bed during illness, inside the council chambers during moments of supreme crisis. Intact courtiers came and went with the political winds. The eunuchs remained. They were permanent fixtures, accumulating state secrets the way coral accumulates calcium, building reefs of influence that could sink any intact rival. Wei Zhongxian started as a gambling addict who had castrated himself with a kitchen knife to escape murderous debt collectors. By 1623, he effectively ruled all of China. The emperor was a disinterested teenager, more fascinated by woodworking than by governance. Wei stepped effortlessly into the vacuum, appointing his allies to every key position, purging his enemies with forged evidence, building an unassailable network of eunuch administrators that controlled every single aspect of the government. They called him the 9,000 Years, a title deliberately chosen to be just short of the emperor's 10,000 years. The irony was not subtle. A man who had cut off his own genitals now decided the fate of hundreds of millions. Intact, educated officials had to kowtow to someone they would have spit upon in the streets. But Wei had what they could never have: unlimited access, the emperor's ear, the absolute power to filter what reached the throne and what mysteriously disappeared. In Ottoman Turkey, the Kislar Aga commanded a different kind of authority. The chief black eunuch controlled the sultan's harem, 300 women, scores of children. The very future of the Ottoman dynasty lived behind doors that only he could enter freely. Any intact man would face immediate death for stepping inside. But the Kislar Aga moved with impunity among the sultan's wives and concubines. His sexlessness meant he was safe. His mutilation meant he was trusted. But even this unlimited, intoxicating power could not buy back what had been taken. For all their immense influence, eunuchs lived with daily, humiliating reminders of their incompleteness. Nurses commanded legions, but still urinated through a tube. Zheng Hu explored new worlds, but returned every time to an empty bed. Wei Zhongxian ruled China, but his own body rebelled against him. Wider hips, softening features, a voice that could crack at the most inopportune moments. Power, it turned out, could not restore what the knives had so permanently removed. The most successful eunuchs learned to channel their profound loss into pure, unadulterated ambition. What else was left for them? They had no families to distract them, no sexual desires to complicate their alliances, just a fierce, laser focus on accumulating influence. They worked longer hours than any intact official, studied harder, schemed deeper. They had to. Excellence was their only possible path to respect. Competence was their only counterweight to mockery. But beneath the silk robes and the golden titles, the shame always persisted. Enemy propagandists knew exactly where to strike. Call a rival general a coward, and he might laugh. Call him weak, and he would prove you wrong on the battlefield. But call a eunuch a half-man, remind him publicly of his mutilation, and you could watch him crumble from the inside. You could watch decades of political achievement evaporate in the face of that fundamental, biological incompleteness. Some eunuchs tried desperately to hide their condition. They grew beards if they could manage even wispy ones. They deepened their voices through years of vocal training. They walked with an exaggerated masculine stride, but their bodies always told the truth, regardless of the performance. The softness of their faces, the unique gait caused by irreversible hormonal changes, the simple, inescapable inability to stand and urinate like a man. Power made them feared, but it could never make them whole. Others chose a different path, embracing their difference. If society was determined to mark them as neither man nor woman, they would create their own, third category. Eunuch fashion in various courts became deliberately and flamboyantly ornate. They wore bright, colorful robes that intact men would not dare to wear, and heavy jewelry that announced their special status. If you could not hide your mutilation, the strategy was to flaunt it, to transform it from a badge of shame into a mark of unique, privileged access. The relationship between eunuchs and intact courtiers remained perpetually tense, a delicate dance of mutual need battling mutual disgust. Intact officials needed the eunuchs' access to the throne. The eunuchs needed intact allies to perform tasks that required a normal, whole body. They worked together while secretly despising one another. They competed for influence while occupying entirely different social spheres. The intact had the respect of society. The eunuchs had the ear of the emperor. Gang Bing rose from the most abject poverty to control the vast Ming imperial workshops. Castrated at 8, sold by parents who needed food more than they needed another son, he oversaw, by age 40, the production of everything from imperial silk to the finest swords. His efficiency was legendary. His methods were brutal. Workers who missed their quotas faced severe punishment. Those who stole faced execution. But the emperor valued results far more than mercy. And Gang Bing delivered nothing but results. The factory floors told the entire story. Hundreds of workers bent over looms and forges while Gang's eunuch assistants prowled between them. These overseers had been cut young, trained from childhood to spot the slightest laziness or theft. They moved with that particular, careful grace of the castrated. Their high voices called out production counts. Their soft, uncalloused hands held whips used for encouragement. Gang Bing himself worked 18-hour days. No wife ever waited for him at home. No children required his attention. The factories were his only family, the production numbers his only offspring. He slept in a small, sparse room above the main floor, waking at the sound of any disturbance. The workers whispered that he never truly slept, that his mutilation had changed more than his body. It had created something relentless and inhuman in its focus. At council meetings, intact officials were forced to pretend respect. This creature, who would have been begging in the streets without imperial favor, now controlled budgets larger than entire provinces. His recommendations shaped national trade policy. His efficiency reports determined which industries received funding and which were shuttered. They bowed to him in public and were secretly sickened in private by their own submission. We tell ourselves these ancient horrors are safely buried in the dust of history, until you realize, with a chilling clarity, that they never really ended. They simply evolved. The judge's gavel fell in an Alabama courtroom in 2024, its sound as final as a hammer on flesh. Chemical castration or life in prison. Choose. The defendant stood convicted of crimes against children. His lawyer had already explained the cold mathematics of his dilemma. Accept the needle and walk free in 5 years. Refuse and die behind bars. It was the same ancient choice, merely dressed in modern, legal language. The knife had been replaced by a syringe. The public square had been replaced by a sterile medical facility. But the ultimate goal remained unchanged: unmake the man to protect the society. The bailiff shifted his weight, his leather belt creaking. Someone in the gallery coughed nervously. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting to record which form of castration the state would impose. Because, make no mistake, both options ended with the same fundamental result. One used chemicals, the other used time. Both were designed to destroy the man standing at the defendant's table. He chose the needle. They almost always choose the needle. The program started the very next week. Depo-Provera, 500 milligrams, injected deep into the muscle of his shoulder every 3 months. The nurse wore purple latex gloves and avoided all eye contact. It was just another medical procedure, just another patient. The forms he signed were filled with clean clinical language: hormone therapy, testosterone suppression. Side effects may include. They did not mention that he was volunteering for the same biological destruction the Byzantines had achieved with bronze blades and boiling oil. By the 3rd injection, his body began its slow-motion betrayal. The beard that had grown thick since he was 16 thinned to pathetic wisps. His muscle mass decreased despite diligent prison workouts. His voice did not rise in pitch like the ancient eunuchs. But something in his eyes changed. A deadness that came from feeling nothing where something had once burned. The other inmates knew. They could smell it on him. The chemical eunuch. The voluntary half-man. The same arguments used in the Roman Senate now echo in our modern courtrooms. Protect society from dangerous men. Remove their ability to harm. Take away the weapon between their legs. Roman senators made these arguments about captured enemy soldiers. Modern prosecutors make them about sex offenders. The language has evolved, but the underlying logic has not budged an inch. Some men are too dangerous to be allowed to remain whole. The state, therefore, must intervene for public safety, for justice, for civilization itself. But if you listen closer to those arguments, if you really listen, you will hear phrases that could have come directly from the ledger books of Constantinople's cutting houses, from the lips of Persian torturers, from any palace where absolute power decided that certain men needed unmaking. We have just replaced the crude tools with sophisticated chemicals. We have exchanged the public spectacle for a private injection. The horror continues. We have simply learned to hide it better. Poland made it mandatory in 2010. South Korea followed in 2011. Chemical castration for convicted child sex offenders. No choice. No alternative. The needle now waits at the end of every guilty verdict. Russia followed, then Turkey, then Indonesia. The practice is spreading like one of ancient Rome's conquests, each new country claiming it has found the humane solution, the modern answer to an eternal problem. The doctors who administer these programs are the direct descendants of the Byzantine physicians. They are just following protocols, just doing their jobs. They measure hormone levels and document physical changes with the same professional detachment as the palace cutters, counting their successful procedures, this many cc's of Lupron, that many weeks of treatment. Success is measured in testosterone readings, dropping below castrate levels. Castrate levels. They actually use that precise term in modern medical journals, in court documents, in treatment plans, as if openly acknowledging that chemical and surgical castration achieve biologically identical ends. The methods differ. The mutilation remains. We have just become far more adept at pretending otherwise. The listed side effects read like a page from a Byzantine eunuch's diary. Bone density loss, muscle wasting, hot flashes, severe depression, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. The drugs do not simply suppress testosterone. They systematically dismantle male biology, piece by piece, system by system, until what remains is neither a healthy man nor a fully functional human, but something broken in between. What we call humane would horrify us if we truly understood the historical lineage. Consider California, which sterilized over 20,000 people between 1909 and 1964. They called it eugenics. They called it protecting society's genetic future. The program specifically targeted the disabled, the mentally ill, the poor, anyone whose reproduction was deemed a threat to the state's vision of perfection. They used surgery then, cutting out ovaries, severing vas deferens, creating a permanent underclass of the sterilized. The doctors kept meticulous records, just like the Byzantines, just like the Chinese cutting houses, forms in triplicate, consent documents signed under duress. They photographed subjects before and after, measured skull shapes, documented family histories, all to justify why certain humans deserved this surgical unmaking. North Carolina's program ran until 1977. This is not ancient history. This is your parents' generation, perhaps your own. Social workers could petition for sterilization. Judges could order it. The state could decide that your body was too dangerous to be allowed to remain intact. 7,600 documented victims, most of them black, most of them poor, most of them women. But the men faced castration too. They called it treatment. They said it would help them integrate into society. They used the exact same justifications the Nazis used, the same reasoning echoed by every empire that ever practiced systematic castration. We are helping you. We are curing you. We are making you safe for civilized company. The knife, forever disguised as medicine. The mutilation, perpetually wrapped in legal procedure. Modern chemical castration wears the same disguise. Voluntary, they insist. A choice between prison and the injection. But what kind of choice is that? Accept the physical destruction of your manhood, or we will impose social and physical death by incarceration. Let us unmake your body, or we will unmake your life. The coercion is simply cleaner now. No hooded executioners, no screaming crowds, just quiet, brightly lit rooms, legal documents written in impenetrable jargon, and the slow, chemical dissolution of the self. The men in these modern programs report the same core experiences as the ancient eunuchs. Phantom sensations where desire used to live, bodies that no longer feel like home. The peculiar, profound grief of losing something you are told you should not have wanted in the first place. They use different words, clinical terms, but read between the lines of their testimonies and you will hear the same anguish that echoed through the Byzantine recovery chambers. One man in Texas, 3 years into his mandatory treatment, described it in a hushed interview. "I'm not me anymore. I look in the mirror and I see a stranger. They said it would just affect my sex drive. They didn't say it would take everything that made me feel human. The methods have evolved, but the dark impulse remains unchanged. We tell ourselves we are more civilized, more humane. We use chemicals instead of knives, medical facilities instead of public squares. But the goal has not shifted by a single degree. Take men who are deemed a threat to the social order and make them less than men. Remove the danger by systematically removing the very biology that defines them. Physical or chemical, the castration serves the same purpose it always has: state control over the bodies of those who threaten the state's order. The modern insidious twist is that we now make them complicit in the act. Sign here to accept treatment, initial here to acknowledge the side effects, date here to confirm your voluntary participation. The men in Alabama and California and Poland sign on the dotted line because the alternative is objectively worse. But that signature allows the rest of us to pretend that this is medicine, not mutilation. That it is treatment, not torture. That it is progress, and not the same ancient horror delivered in new, sterile packaging. Even the resistance follows the ancient, tragic patterns. Men skip their injections, flee the jurisdiction, take black market testosterone to counter the state-prescribed drugs. Their bodies fight a desperate rearguard action to restore what the chemistry has stolen. Just like the Byzantine eunuchs who tried magical herbs and desperate prayers to regrow what was gone. Just like the Chinese palace servants who paid fortune-tellers for restoration spells. It is the same desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, wholeness might be recovered. It never is. Chemical castration is theoretically reversible. In theory, you stop the drugs and testosterone production resumes. But theory is not practice. After years of suppression, many men's bodies simply forget how to produce normal hormonal levels. The damage lingers, often permanently. Bone density does not fully recover. Muscle mass remains diminished. The psychological scars stay raw and open. They may be free from the needle, but they are never truly free from what the needle did to them. And yet, the programs continue to expand. More states add mandatory provisions. More countries adopt the practice. Politicians campaign on getting tough on predators, on protecting our children, on making our communities safe. It is the same rhetoric that has justified every systematic castration program in human history. A different century, the same underlying fear, the same proposed solution. And just like the ancient programs, mission creep is inevitable. You start with the very worst offenders, the child predators, the violent rapists. Then, you quietly expand the criteria to include lesser crimes, exhibitionism, voyeurism, consensual acts the state arbitrarily deems deviant. The line shifts, slowly and inexorably. The needle finds new targets. Power always discovers new categories of men who need unmaking. In some countries, they even offer it to gay men. Voluntary chemical castration to cure homosexuality. The echo of the Nazi programs is deafening, but they call it conversion therapy. They call it helping men overcome unwanted desires, as if desire itself is the crime, as if the ultimate solution to human difference is the chemical elimination of the very thing that makes us feel alive. The multinational corporations manufacturing these drugs profit handsomely from this modern form of castration. Billions of dollars in annual revenue, all from medications designed to unmake men. They lobby for expanded use. They fund studies showing effectiveness. They donate to politicians who support mandatory programs. The cutting houses have been replaced by pharmaceutical corporations, but the business model remains eerily, terrifyingly familiar. There is money, it seems, in mutilation. There always has been. We dress it in different clothes. We use different words. We pretend we are nothing like the Byzantines with their damp basement chambers, nothing like the Mongols with their crushing boards. But if you strip away the medical language and the legal justifications, what remains is the same old horror. The state deciding which men deserve to remain whole and which men must be broken for the greater good. The knife has been replaced by the needle, but the cut is just as deep and the wound is just as permanent. What happens in those clean, modern injection rooms would be instantly, tragically recognizable to any Byzantine eunuch, to any Chinese boy processed through a Beijing cutting house, to any man who ever faced castration in any era. The tools have evolved. The intent has remained. The horror has simply learned to hide behind consent forms and clinical trials. The future, unless we consciously choose otherwise, promises only more of the same. New drugs, more targeted effects, perhaps subdermal implants that release castration chemicals automatically, perhaps even genetic modifications that prevent masculine development entirely. The methods will keep evolving. The medical papers will call each new advance more humane than the last. And men will keep being unmade, all in the service of state power and social fear. But at least we can pretend it is medicine. At least we can sign the forms and keep the neat records and tell ourselves, with absolute conviction, this is different. We are not like those ancient barbarians with their knives and their acids and their trained animals. We are civilized. We use chemicals. We follow protocols. We get consent. The men walking out of those treatment centers, their bodies forever altered, their manhood dissolved by modern chemistry, might beg to differ. But their voices, like the voices of eunuchs throughout history, are always the easiest to ignore. After all, they signed the papers. They chose the needle. What right do the chemically castrated have to complain? Which brings us, at last, back to where this journey began, to that flickering Byzantine chamber. The boy on the wooden table. The knife poised above his terrified flesh. The scream about to shatter the palace silence. We have traveled through 7 different methods of castration, witnessed 7 distinct forms of horror, and we have not even yet reached the most disturbing revelation of all. The boy's scream was cut short as his body went rigid. In that Byzantine chamber, a lifetime of nightmares began, with the wet, final sound of bronze meeting living flesh. The physician's hand moved with a practiced, pitiless efficiency. 2 cuts, 57 seconds. A lifetime of potential destroyed in less time than it takes to pour a cup of wine. Blood pooled on the cold stone as palace attendants pressed the hot iron to the wound. The sizzle of cauterization mixed with the boy's choked, fading whimpers. They would carry him to the recovery chamber, where 19 other boys lay in various stages of healing or dying. But we are not following him there. Not just yet. Fast forward 37 years. The same boy, now the Grand Vizier of Constantinople, stands before Emperor Constantine VII. His voice, high and reedy from that long-ago night's work, now commands the attention of generals twice his size. The hand that signs imperial death warrants still shakes slightly,